the world was caught off guard. A single drone strike from Burkina Faso sent shockwaves across continents and left world powers scrambling for answers. Was it a warning, a declaration of independence, or a message the West could no longer ignore? In today's video, we uncover the story behind Traoré's bold move and why it might change Africa's place in global politics forever. But before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our deep dive stories on Africa's rising changemakers and the events reshaping our world. As the dust settled from the drone strike, the ripples across Africa grew stronger by the day. From Dakar to Nairobi, from Lagos to Johannesburg, people were talking about Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For some, he was a symbol of defiance, proof that Africa could stand tall in a world often dominated by others. For others, he was a risky gamble, a young soldier making choices that could provoke dangerous consequences. But one thing was certain, Africa was awake. In the streets of Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in support rallies, waving flags and chanting slogans about sovereignty. Murals of Traoré began appearing on walls, depicting him not just as a military leader, but as a revolutionary figure. Street vendors sold t-shirts with his image and the words, "Unstoppable Africa." For ordinary citizens, it was more than politics. It was pride. In neighboring countries, similar emotions surfaced. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, nations that had also seen military takeovers, young people drew inspiration from Burkina Faso's bold stance. They shared videos and speeches online, building a digital wave of solidarity that connected African youth across borders. For the first time in generations, many felt they were part of a shared destiny. At African universities, debates filled lecture halls. Students argued passionately, was this the start of a continental revolution, or simply one man's defiance? Professors pointed out the historic parallels, from the independence movements of the 1960s to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. History, they said, was repeating itself, but with new tools, drones, digital platforms, and a globally connected generation. African leaders, too, felt the tremors. Some quietly admired Traoré's courage, though few said so openly. Others worried that his bold actions could trigger instability, sanctions, or even military retaliation from the West. In high-level summits of the African Union, the air was heavy with debate. Should the continent rally around Burkina Faso, or should it urge caution? What stood out most was the reaction of Africa's younger generation. With more than 60% of the continent's population under 25, their voices carried enormous weight. On TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, videos praising Traoré went viral. Memes compared him to great African icons of the past, while hashtags like Africa Rising and Unstoppable. Africa spread like wildfire. But this awakening was not without division. Some African voices urged restraint, warning that bold symbolism was not enough. They argued that true independence required strong institutions, economic self-sufficiency, and unity among nations. Others countered that without bold acts of defiance, the dream of sovereignty would never materialize. Meanwhile, civil society movements grew louder, calling for Pan-African cooperation in technology, agriculture, and defense. The drone strike, though a single act, had sparked conversations about Africa's long-term future. Would it remain dependent, or would it finally chart its own course? For the first time in decades, Africa's awakening was not being dictated from outside. It was unfolding from within, led by its people, its youth, and its leaders willing to take risks. The awakening was not about one strike, nor one man. It was about a continent realizing its potential and daring to imagine a future shaped on its own terms. In Washington, London, and Paris, the aftermath of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's drone strike created a storm of confusion. For decades, Western capitals had seen West Africa as part of their strategic influence, militarily, politically, and economically. But now, a young leader from a landlocked country had disrupted that order with a single act. In the Pentagon, intelligence officers scrambled to assess the strike. Was it a calculated warning or the beginning of something larger? Analysts pored over satellite images, intercepted communications, and military data, searching for answers. One thing was certain, this was not an accident. Traoré had made a deliberate choice to send a message, one that the West could not ignore. In Paris, the response was even more emotional. France, long entangled in West African affairs, viewed the strike as a direct challenge to its historic role in the region. Politicians debated fiercely in the French National Assembly. Some demanded a strong response, economic sanctions, perhaps even military pressure. Others warned that heavy-handed tactics could backfire, further alienating African nations already, drifting away from French influence. In London, the tone was more cautious. The UK had fewer ties to Burkina Faso, but officials worried about a broader trend. If one African leader could defy Western powers so openly, what would stop others? Would alliances shift? Would Africa begin to speak with a stronger, unified voice? British analysts concluded that the issue was not just about Burkina Faso, it was about the future balance of global power. Washington, however, faced the greatest dilemma. The US had long positioned itself as a global promoter of stability. Yet, in this case, Traoré's action had resonated deeply with populations across Africa, many of whom admired his boldness. To respond too aggressively risked painting America as the enemy of African independence. To stay silent, on the other hand, could embolden others to follow Traoré's lead. Inside the White House Situation Room, advisors weighed options: diplomatic, pressure, intelligence sharing, covert operations, or simply letting the storm pass. The president's team debated late into the night. One advisor argued that Traoré's actions threatened international norms and must be met with consequences. Another countered that overreaction would only fuel his growing image as a resistance hero. Meanwhile, Western media amplified the debate. Some outlets portrayed Traoré as reckless and dangerous, a young leader playing with fire. Others, however, highlighted the historical context. Decades of foreign military bases, economic dependency, and the frustration of African youth. Television debates grew heated, with experts asking whether the West had underestimated Africa's determination to forge its own destiny. European leaders also worried about energy security and migration routes, fearing instability might ripple beyond Africa. For the West, the challenge was not simply strategic, it was symbolic. A leader from one of the world's poorest nations had forced the most powerful countries to pause, to reconsider, and to react. The dilemma was clear. Should the West push back hard and risk deepening the rift? Or should it adapt to a new reality where African leaders no longer followed the old script? For now, the Western capitals hesitated, balancing between firmness and restraint. But one thing was undeniable. Traoré had forced them into a conversation they could no longer avoid. The shockwaves of Traoré's drone strike did not stop at the borders of Europe or America. Within days, the incident had ignited a global debate, one that reached from African capitals to the streets of Asia and the halls of the United Nations. Africa, the reaction was electrifying. Across the continent, radio shows buzzed with callers expressing both admiration and concern. For some, Traoré's action symbolized courage, a declaration that African nations would no longer be passive, observers of their destiny. To others, it raised unsettling questions about escalation and retaliation. In Bamako, Mali, and Niamey, Niger, countries that had also recently challenged old alliances, Traoré was celebrated as a kindred spirit. Young people marched with flags, chanting slogans of independence and resilience. Social media platforms across Africa erupted with trending hashtags, some praising him as a new voice of sovereignty, while others urged caution. Strength must be measured, not reckless. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, diplomats found themselves under pressure to take a position. Should they condemn the strike to preserve diplomatic ties, or should they support it as a symbol of African autonomy? The debate grew heated. Some member states argued that Africa needed leaders bold enough to redraw the global balance, while others feared that Traoré's actions might provoke economic sanctions or worse. Meanwhile, in Asia, reactions were nuanced. In Beijing, analysts framed the strike as evidence of Africa stepping into a multipolar world, where smaller nations could defy Western dominance. Commentators suggested that such moves might open doors to new partnerships beyond Europe and America. In Moscow, state media painted Traoré as a young leader standing up to neo-colonial pressure, drawing parallels with historical moments of defiance. But the debate was not without criticism. In the Middle East, some leaders quietly worried about the precedent of military boldness spilling into already tense regions. In South America, intellectuals and journalists compared Traoré's defiance to their own histories of resisting outside control, sparking conversations about solidarity across continents. The United Nations, meanwhile, became a stage for diplomacy. In New York, an emergency meeting was called, where ambassadors delivered carefully worded speeches. Western powers spoke of destabilizing actions and unpredictable consequences. African representatives, however, emphasized sovereignty, insisting that global powers must respect Africa's right to chart its own path. The room was tense, the applause divided. Beyond governments and institutions, ordinary people around the globe joined the conversation. Some saw Traoré's strike as reckless, others as revolutionary. Universities held debates, journalists wrote fiery op-eds, and online forums filled with passionate exchanges. For many, it wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about the meaning of independence in a world still grappling with power imbalances. What made the moment so significant was not just the strike itself, but the symbolism it carried. A nation often dismissed on the global stage had forced the entire world to take notice. And in doing so, Traoré had sparked a conversation that reached far beyond military strategy. It was about identity, dignity, and the shifting currents of history. As the days turned into weeks, one thing became clear. Whether celebrated or condemned, Traoré's action had redefined the debate on Africa's role in the world. News of the drone strike reached Western capitals within hours. In Washington, Paris, London, and Brussels, the incident was met with a mixture of disbelief and urgency. Analysts crowded television studios, intelligence officers drafted reports, and government spokespeople rushed to deliver carefully measured statements. To the west, Burkina Faso was not a country expected to stage such a bold maneuver. The region had long been seen through the lens of instability and dependence. And yet, here was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, unflinching, and resolute, making a move that caught the attention of the most powerful governments in the world. In Paris, the reaction carried an added weight. France, once the colonial ruler of Burkina Faso, had long maintained a military and economic presence in West Africa. But now, Traoré's strike seemed to declare that the era of quiet compliance was over. French media debated fiercely. Was this the rise of a dangerous defiance or the beginning of a new African independence? Commentators clashed on air, their voices rising with every broadcast. In Washington, the tone was cautious, but serious. Security experts warned of a new precedent, a smaller nation flexing its military strength not in hidden skirmishes, but in symbolic actions visible to the entire globe. What message does this send? One U.S. official asked during a televised interview. If one leader can challenge international expectations this directly, what's to stop others from doing the same? London and Brussels echoed the concern. Editorials in major newspapers described the incident as a wake-up call, a reminder that the balance of global influence was shifting. For decades, Africa had been spoken of as a region to be stabilized or assisted. But Traoré's drone strike shattered that narrative, forcing Western powers to confront the possibility that Africa was no longer asking permission. It was taking its own course. Behind closed doors, however, discussions were more heated. Diplomatic cables described the act as a test of Western resolve. Some leaders argued for immediate pressure, economic, political, even military, to ensure Burkina Faso did not inspire a larger movement. Others cautioned restraint, noting that overt retaliation might only strengthen Traoré's image as a defender of African sovereignty. Meanwhile, Western media struggled to frame the story. Some outlets called it reckless, others called it bold. Headlines carried words like shockwave, defiance, and turning point. But beneath the noise, one reality stood clear. The West had been shaken. For decades, decisions affecting Africa had often been made far from its soil, in boardrooms and parliaments thousands of miles away. Now, in one decisive act, the balance of perception had shifted. Burkina Faso was not just reacting to world events, it was shaping them. As night fell in European and American cities, and the glowing news tickers replayed the story again and again, one truth hung in the air. The world had underestimated Africa's resolve. And Traore had just sent a message the West could not ignore. The morning after the drone strike, the story begins to spread. First through local whispers, then through social media, and soon across television screens worldwide. For many in Burkina Faso, the event is more than news. It is a sign that their nation is no longer silent. In marketplaces, conversations shift from daily struggles to the boldness of their young leader. Mothers carrying baskets of fruit speak with pride, taxi drivers recount the moment to passengers, and young students debate the implications with fiery energy. The question on everyone's lips is the same. What does this mean for us? Across Africa, the ripple spreads. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, nations that have also stood at crossroads of instability and change, the news resonates deeply. Traore's action is seen as more than a local decision. It is interpreted as a shared cry for sovereignty, a statement that African nations are reclaiming their right to self-determination. In Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, the reactions vary, but the conversations are alive. Some praise Traore as a visionary, someone unafraid to confront the giants of international politics. Others worry that such a bold stance might provoke reactions too heavy for Burkina Faso to bear. Yet whether in admiration or concern, one truth is undeniable. Africa is paying attention. Leaders of neighboring nations, too, cannot ignore the symbolism. Some view it with caution, calculating the risks of aligning too closely with a path that challenges established global powers. Others see in it an opportunity, a spark that could inspire unity across a continent often divided by borders, but united in history and struggle. But the echo of this moment is not confined to governments or institutions. It is strongest in the hearts of ordinary people, the farmers tilling their land, the traders moving between towns, the young Africans scrolling on their phones late at night. To them, Traore's move is proof that leadership can look different. It can be young, it can be daring, it can be unapologetically African. Yet with hope also comes uncertainty. Whispers of, "What happens next?" weave into the conversations. Will this bring protection or retaliation? Will this strengthen the nation or isolate it further? Still, in the streets of Ouagadougou, amidst the dust, music, and color, one feeling dominates above all others: pride. For once, they are not waiting for an outside power to define their story. They are watching their own leader write it in real time. And so, the echo spreads, from one village to another, from one capital to another, until it becomes more than an echo. It becomes a drumbeat, a rhythm of defiance, of self-belief, of a continent finding its own voice. Traore's strike may have been local, but its resonance is continental. And in that resonance, Africa begins to see a reflection of its own unstoppable spirit. Night descends over Ouagadougou. The city, vibrant during the day with the rhythm of its markets and the pulse of its people, is quiet now. But high above, the silence is broken. The faint hum of machinery cuts through the darkness. It is the sound of drones, an unfamiliar presence, yet one that carries immense significance. The world does not yet know what is about to unfold. In the capital, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's young leader, stands before a small group of trusted officials. He is calm, his expression firm, his tone deliberate. Every gesture speaks of determination, not recklessness. To him, the drones represent more than weapons. They represent sovereignty, control, and above all, a message. This is not simply a military exercise. This is a signal, a statement written not in speeches or press releases, but in action. For decades, Africa has been framed by others, described in boardrooms far away, analyzed in think tanks, oceans apart, debated in foreign parliaments. But tonight, under the quiet sky of Burkina Faso, a different story is being written. As the drones hover, the hum becomes a symbol. For some watching, it may sound threatening. For others, it is the music of independence, the rhythm of a continent, taking its destiny in its own hands. And at the center of it all is Traoré, not just as a leader, but as the embodiment of Africa's young voice. Observers say he is bold, perhaps even daring. But to his supporters, his courage is exactly what the moment demands. The people of Burkina Faso have endured years of insecurity, instability, and outside influence. Tonight, they see in Traoré's decision a spark, the possibility of a future where they are no longer waiting for someone else to act. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware of the global conversations that will soon erupt. In newsrooms from Paris to Washington, headlines are being drafted. In embassies and security councils, whispers are turning into questions. What is Burkina Faso doing? What message is being sent? And more importantly, how should the world respond? But for now, inside the command center, there is only focus. The screens glow with tracking signals, the controllers move with precision, and the drones continue their quiet dance in the night sky. To Traoré, this moment is not just about tactics, it is about symbolism. The unseen signal is clear. Africa is stepping forward, no longer content to be silent, no longer willing to be sidelined. And though the drones may be invisible to the sleeping city below, their message will soon be heard across the entire world. As the world replayed the footage of the strike, one question echoed in diplomatic circles, media headlines, and everyday conversations. What message was Traoré sending to the West? For decades, Africa had often been seen through the lens of dependency, reliant on aid, foreign troops, and outside interventions. But this strike shattered that perception. It was more than a military maneuver. It was a declaration. Africa would no longer be a silent observer in global affairs. Western analysts scrambled to interpret the move. Some dismissed it as reckless, a desperate attempt by a young leader to assert dominance. Others, however, saw something more profound, the beginning of a shift in Africa's geopolitical posture. It was no longer about asking for recognition, it was about demanding it. In think tanks across Washington, Paris, and London, debates grew intense. Could this strike mark the start of a new Africa, one unwilling to bow to foreign influence, or was it an isolated act of defiance, destined to fade? Policy experts warned that dismissing the message would be a grave mistake. But what exactly was the message? To many Africans, it was simple. Respect us. Treat us as equals. Recognize that Africa is not a playground for power struggles, but a continent of sovereign nations with their own destinies. Traoré's action was not just against an adversary, it was against the old narratives that painted Africa as weak, dependent, or voiceless. The response from the West was cautious. Official statements called for restraint and stability, but beneath the diplomatic language, there was an unmistakable tone of unease. Military advisors worried about the precedent. If Burkina Faso could deploy drones in such a bold fashion, what would stop others? The balance of power, long assumed to be tilted, was being recalibrated. Meanwhile, African commentators framed the event as part of a bigger story. It was not just Burkina Faso, nor just Traoré. It was a message on behalf of the entire continent. Africa would define its own security, shape its own politics, and demand its place at the global table. In the streets of Ouagadougou, the people already understood this message. For them, it was not about drones or geopolitics. It was about dignity. It was about a generation that refused to inherit the same struggles their parents endured. It was about being seen, heard, and respected. As history turned another page, one thing became clear. The drone strike would not be remembered solely as a military action. It would be remembered as a symbol, a spark in a larger awakening. And so, the world was left with a question that lingered long after the smoke cleared. Was Traoré's message a warning, a promise, or the beginning of a new era where Africa finally speaks in its own voice? The answer, perhaps, would not come from the West at all. It would come from Africa itself. Traoré's drone strike wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a statement, one that continues to echo far beyond Burkina Faso. The question is no longer whether the world heard the message, but how it will respond. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who should hear Africa's untold stories. Until next time, stay informed and stay curious.